Everything starts with a circle of fifths, perhaps even ends with a circle of fifths, evolves from the circle of fifths, blossoms because of the circle of fifths, and travels away from the circle of fifths in ways that satisfies the grammar expectations for the language commonly shared by so many composers, between Bach and Ravel to take it largely. And the tonal system, more than a language or even a path, is some kind of shared experience that corresponds to the human nature, the tension, the release, the expectation, the desire, and then the reaching of the point. Possibly also on the way colorizing the different tonalities with their different perhaps emotional character. I would never want to take away that connection of harmony with not only meaning but also feeling. And therefore everybody absorbs differently the different aspects of it. Some people are more analytical, some people are more emotional, and some people don't need a lot of one or more of the other. It depends if you play it, if you hear it, if you share it, if you teach it. Inevitably you learn the language, at least the mother tongue, by ear, and the phonemes are sounds that are beautiful without the meaning attached to them. And then little by little you attach meanings which create then perhaps a charged meaning to the sound that originally entered your neurons through your ears and made you say your first syllables in whichever language that is, naturally. And I believe that the circle of fifths, FCG, D, A, E, B, I'm not so familiar easily to say it in English, as Fa, Do, Sol, Re, La, Mi, Si, obviously, are here the 7 tones, the natural 7 tones, which arranged by perfect fifths are sort of our, in a way, clock, or perhaps ring, which allows us to understand how underground, underneath, in between melodic lines and modulations or transpositions in music, there is always the lining of the circle of fifths, either through inversions, either through different forms of expression, but there, sort of the thread that connects it all. And these 7 tones end with the each south or north pole, if you want to call it, or each of the extremes, antipodes, by a tritone. And therefore this augmented fourth or diminished fifth locks the system and allows for the system to create that sense of tension and release in every key. For instance, if we start here, as shown on the page, middle C or Do, and we start adding a fifth going on the right side down, because of each of the tetrachords we add a leading tone. Therefore we add 1 sharp, Fa or F, Do or C sharp, and then 3 sharps, the last one being the leading tone. Therefore in A will be F, C, G or Fa, Do, Sol, Re, F, C, G, D sharp. In B, C majeur, A sharp. I know it's confusing to say the names of the notes in English and in Italian or in Latin. but I'll try to stick to the English because I think it's also very easy to understand for many people who don't do solfege as we call it. But anyway, it's the same story. From the middle C, you go then down, F major, and you add a B flat, so the tetrachord, and therefore second flat for B flat, third flat for E flat, fourth flat for A flat, fifth flat for D flat, and on the each ending under the G flat, which we just heard, the piano doesn't go higher, far down enough, is the G flat, the flat under the D flat, and the sharps also reach the same note, but they call it F sharp. And then, so therefore the middle C and the two tritons, which are same, just spelled differently. If it's spelled with an F sharp going in the side of the clock of the sharps, a triton is by essence a diminished or augmented interval. Therefore it is an interval that needs a resolution, unlike the perfect fifths, which is why it closes to resolve if the F sharp, the sharp leading higher, and if the sharp is called flat and is G flat, then it resolves opening, always semitone up, semitone down. And the resolutions of these two are also creating a triton. It's a vicious circle to say that for the circle of fifths, at least at its antipodes. It's like the lock. And this is the first element to understand, because once we go into understanding that, we have the capacity to understand what a scale is. And in this case, the scale is the result of skipping a fifth in the circle of fifths. I would like to give this example. Here, if you take the first note and the last note of the seven notes natural perfect fifths of C major scale, for the purpose of the example, it's easier because it doesn't have sharps or flats, so that is important because it's easier to figure out and visualize and hear. It's always a combination of seeing, hearing, and feeling, perhaps with the playing, for those who do. But regardless which one of those senses, or the three combined, especially, well, all of them, it helps to comprehend how things go from one shape to the next, from the perfect fifth circle to the scale. And in order to do so, you skip, therefore, a fifth in the circle of fifths. And you obtain your step motion, tone or semitone, which by four of them is tetrachord, in Greek four for four sounds. So this is why when we organize the scale, which is easier to sing in, rather than the range of the fifths, which for the human voice is impossibly stretched, then this one is beautifully stressed into tones and semitones. And therefore, in the order of the scale, which is tonally constructed, we have names: tonic, subtonic, above the tonic meaning, mediant, subdominant, dominant, but the subdominant is under the dominant melodically in the scale, over dominant, and then leading tone, and tonic, which are also magnetically connected by the semitone connection. That said, I must confess that it is important to go back again to the middle C in C major, the tonic, it gives the name of the tone, or in French le ton, which literally means it gives the name to the key. We call it C major. But the reason we call it C major is because the dominant on the 5th degree holds in its womb the leading tone and the subdominant, creating a tritone that locks by its tension for the release the tonality into the C major by the dominant, which naturally dominates. So the dominant is much more important than the tonic, even if the tonic carries the name of the key. And therefore, if you try to organize the 7 tones of the perfect fifths of the tonality of a given key like C major, you have to start with the subdominant of the key through the scale organization, or which would be more clearly indicated as the 5th under the middle C. So if the C tonic has a dominant on the 5th above, in a circle of fifths it has the subdominant in the 5th under. It's exactly the pendulum of a 5th perfect above and under. The under being for the plagal cadence and the dominant for the perfect cadence. Of course, perfect cadence is harmonically stronger because it has the leading tone and the tritone, which create that sense of tension release that locks in the tonality and signs in. We are in C major. Of course, we can do the same thing in another tonality, G major, the dominant, the subdominant, the 5th under, so-called Amen cadence at the end of church service, without leading tone. It's supposed to be weaker because without leading tone, and the two are really around the tonic, a 5th above, a 5th under in every tonality. But when squeezed within a scale with 2 tetrachords, then the subdominant is melodically a step under the degree of the dominant, since it's the 4th and this is the 5th. But in the circle of fifths is the pendant, equal pendant of the dominant. These 2 degrees are used for identification in which tonality we are. When Bach writes Prelude and Fugues, the first thing he does is establish who's the subdominant, and then who's the dominant, and then we know in which key we are. And then he writes, after the Prelude, the Fugue. But this signature of the tonality comes through establishing these 2 main degrees, which are in, again, the circle of fifths organization, really symmetrically around the tonic note. And in the scale organization, the subdominant becomes melodically the underdominant degree. I think that is a first thing to clear and avoid any confusion about. Now I would like to talk to you about the 3rd and the 6th degree that are not subdominant and tonic, which are the tonal notes, but the modal notes. Mode being a major or minor. Of course, originally the modes are descending, ancient Greek, or different modes which evolved also through the times, but were not harmonized and not part of the harmonic tonal system. They were melodic per se. Now the tonal system establishes a scale from the circle of fifths in order to be singable and therefore rangeable within the range of different voices. But at the same time, the mode, major or minor, appears through 2 degrees, the 3rd or the 6th. If the 3rd is minor, then the 6th is major. If the 3rd is major, then the 6th is minor. If the 6th is major, then the 3rd is major. If the 3rd is minor, then the 6th is major. If the 6th is major, then the 3rd is major. If the 6th is major, then the 6th is major. If the 6th is major, then the 3rd is major. If the 6th is major, then the 6th is major. If the 6th is major, then the 6th is major. If the 6th is major, then the 6th is major. If the 6th is major, then the 6th is major. If the 6th is major, then the 6th is major. If the 6th is major, then the 6th is major. If the 6th is major, then the 6th is major. If the 6th is major, then the 6th is major. If the 6th is major, then the 6th is major. If the 6th is major, then the 6th is major. If the 6th is major, then the 6th is major. If the 6 the sixth is minor, then you are in minor. But you have several minors. That's the more subtle part of the tetrachord construction of the minor keys, because in major keys, the two tetrachords being similar, then they can become interchangeable, because then the top one of the C major, tone, tone, semitone, tone, tone, semitone, starting on G, can become the bottom of G major by adding the equivalent, just like a Lego brick. And then you have tone, tone, semitone, and you add an F sharp for the leading tone of G major. And the top tetrachord of G major starting on D, the dominant, becomes the tonic of D major by adding another tetrachord starting on A with the leading tone C sharp. And then A major, 3 sharps, of which G sharp the leading tone. Then E major, of which the leading tone D sharp with 4 sharps. And then if that becomes the bottom of B major, you have 5 sharps, C, D, F, G, A sharp, and G sharp and A sharp being the leading tone. That in minor doesn't function, unfortunately. Well, I wish it did, because it would simplify the teaching of it, but it makes the minor mode so much more expressive, because so much more changing and so much more expressive, because so much more complex and subtle compared to the major, which is so more in front of you, always the same. Up or down? Well, the minor modes differ when they go up or when they go down. And there is one mode that was made up for the harmonic purpose, called the harmonic minor, which is a harmonic progression construction of a scale, when a melodic construction of the scale, it's its essence and origin. But to start with, again, C major as an example. If the third degree becomes minor in the bottom tetrachord, which in this case is E flat, and the top stays major, tone, tone, semitone, you have a sort of a major. I know it's not an official term, of course, I love to call them so. Half minor, tone, semitone, tone, with a minor third, but on the top part, the sixth remains major. And it allows for a step motion through the leading tone, which is connected to the tonic by the magnetic attraction of the semitone. And that we call melodic ascending, only going up. Well, most of the time. Bach often likes to play with us in terms of exploit the different characteristics of the mood that the different minor modes carry, harbor, and manipulate our listeners' psyche by descending, sometimes too, but with the ascending. But the point of the story is not to see if Bach followed the rules or not, is for us to understand the rules and see how we can understand who did or not follow them. But in order to organize the understanding of it, I have to now tell you about the descending minor, which is to do with this time the third and the sixth degree being minor. And that functions only on the way down with a tetrachord, if seen from above down, is major in the construction of tone, tone, semitone. And then the bottom one is tone, semitone, tone, just like the minor one for the ascending. You cannot go, or shouldn't want to go up, at least this way. I prefer to be not appearing to be so preemptive. With a leading tone, but you don't go up with a flat 7. You need to have a leading tone to reach the tonic. So you have two paths to go up and two paths, therefore one to go up and one to go down. And if you combine the two, you obtain what we call the minor harmonic. Now, the reason for which it's harmonic is because its combination is only the result of the harmonic progressions. In this case, the fact that you have 5/6, the so-called deceptive cadence, or possibly the 6th degree in minor being a neighboring tone. And then when you play the tonic, you also can do neighboring tone, but with a leading tone at a semitone distance, and same semitone distance between the dominant and the 6th degree in minor. But you don't pass melodically over this gap that is created by the minor 6th and the leading tone, which is more than the scale's rules, which are to be spaced between tones by tone or semitone, and this is tone and a half, or 3 semitones. In other words, a gap. So when you hear the harmonization, you have to hear how the voices in their layering interact to obtain a harmonic progression where each vertical chord, tonic, subdominant, dominant, and tonic, are there to be heard as their function, but that the voice leading of the different layers brings you to understand that in fact the A flat of the alto part doesn't go to the B natural. In other words, you don't have a voice melodically doing this. Even if on the piano played chordal, it can blend to appear as such. But if you voice it, you hear sol, la, sol, sol, do, do, si, do, mi, fa, re, mi, sol, la, sol, sol, do, do, si, do, mi, fa, re, mi. But not sol, la, si, do, let less, do, si, la, sol. So the melodic movement of the voice leading that you want to have in proper harmony in terms of organization of your voices on a given bass motion, that is usually the cadence, in this case 5/6 for the deceptive, or 4/5/1 for the perfect, or perhaps 4/1 for the plagal, etc. Those voices, it matters a lot for them to be most step motion possible, or common notes between triads. And these are good things to know, because you start hearing more than what you absorb at first listening. I don't speak about reading, but I speak about hearing. And of course it depends who plays it, or who is orchestrating it, or who is singing it, if it's choir, orchestra, solo, pianist, chamber music. Of course it more or less blends, but it shouldn't in your understanding of the minor mode, which triggers for us mostly into the romanticism of the 19th century, or the sense of sadness. But I think these are, again, it's necessary to speak about it, because it's not possible not to see that major seems to be hopeful and minor has some kind of sorrow in it. But that is away from the explanation of the mode. So in part you have to speak about the effect that minor brings to our soul when we hear it, which is why it's there, and then how it's constructed for itself, by itself. It's exactly like learning the grammar, understanding the meaning of the phonemes of the word that you learned by ear in your mother tongue, and then all of a sudden you use them with a precision that, if you have a good vocabulary, makes you eloquent or less, more or less. But in other words, you choose the meanings and you choose the nuances in the spoken language, the same way you can choose the nuances of a minor harmonic or ascending minor that is partly major, partly minor in its construction, or fully minor. So these nuances come also from these constructions. But in any case, you don't use melodically the augmented second, which is so beautiful in a non-harmonized chordal system, but in monodic or just melodic music coming from the Orient, like Turkey, Arabia. Where you don't orchestrate, meaning, or harmonize rather, that. Now, going to speak about the chromatic scale. The chromatic scale has something very special about itself, is that it's all semitones. And so therefore, if you want to organize the spelling, you have to make sure that you learn that the sharps go up and the flats go down. That said, there is an exception, as usual, which confirms the rule. At least that's what I learned in French grammar, and I'm going to apply it on music grammar. We are back to our tetrachords. And in major, they're tone, tone, semitone. Therefore, the semitone EF, BC, doesn't need to be changed because there already are semitones. But since the chromatic scale is to introduce or inject semitones everywhere there are tones, like for instance the first two, C, D, it adds C sharp because the sharp goes up. Between D and E, the sharps goes up. Between E and F, you don't call it E sharp because in the key of C major, you already have the semitone with a different name of the notes, E and F. You don't have to sharp it because it's a semitone. I hope that is not too confusing. Then, of course, F and G is a whole tone, therefore you need to add the F sharp going up. G and A, G sharp, A and A, B, A sharp, and B, C, semitone, leading tone, tonic. Therefore, if you write in whole notes, and you add in black keys or in quarter notes indications just to visualize it, you see how you semitonize going up by sharping, and you flat down by going down semitonizing the tone between the leading tone and the 6th degree, B, A becoming B flat, A. Between A and G, A flat. I bypass purposely the 5th degree to go down to 3, flat 2, and flat 1, I mean flat 3, and flat 2, 1. F, E, E flat, D, D flat, C. The reason I bypassed the 5th degree because within G and F it's a tone. Therefore, logically it should be called G flat since we're going down with flats. Which harmonized would be what we call a secondary dominant to, therefore, its own dropping 5th movement of the perfect 5th baseline movement of any perfect cadence. And therefore it lands on a degree we don't have in C major, but in chromatic C major we do because it's flat 2 or D flat. Therefore the G flat is the dominant 7th of secondary dominant of flat 2. That flat 2 degree used in the first inversion is very often called also Neapolitan 6. But the reason for which, for spelling purposes, on the dominant of G, the note G, the dominant of C, sorry for this confusion, I hope it's not confusing, one also calls the F sharp going down to F, even if it's a sharp and it shouldn't be a flat going down, because of the other secondary dominant function, main one, which is the dominant of the dominant. Again, the 5th above to resolve to the dominant, to the tonic. And in this case it would be on D with an F sharp, and this F sharp would drop to F natural, and it's the only case where you have a sharp that doesn't go up as they all do, and all flats go down, with the exception of F sharp going down to F in the spelling, if it is harmonized as a secondary dominant of the dominant. And if it's harmonized as a secondary dominant of flat 2, then it's a G flat. I know it's not meaningful so much in most cases because this key on the piano is the same key. The Fa sharp going up to G or the G flat going down to F. It's just the direction in which it goes that expects to be called flat or sharp. But most of the scales, chromatic included, have a necessity in this tonal system based on a circle of fifths and reduced to scales for practical practices of singing and performing and even harmonizing. SATB, soprano, alto, tenor, bass in 4 parts. Inevitably, we have to work on understanding how we spell them, even if we don't hear the different quarter tone, if that were to be the case, between a G flat and an F sharp. But we know that there is such. And naturally, we have melodically also 2 other types of scales which are not tonal at all, or therefore not harmonized a lot at all. Both a lot and at all. The full scale that's popularized by Debussy, or the pentatonic, which is so much more in the folkloric music of all music from Asia. And in these cases, these tones are not related in a hierarchy of dominants, subdominants, leading tones, tension releases. They're not harmonized. You don't do that. And therefore, they exist as melodic components which are used melodically, just like in the Arabian scale, the augmented second. I mean, it's very reductive, but it is factually easy to replace in its space-time frame, and that is, after all, the context that explains it. And the 6 tones of the whole tone scale, Debussy using a lot of parallel chords, augmented 5th chords. But these 2 scales are just as an example to prove why they're not in the tonal system and why they're not organized to be part of the tonal system. Now in the notation, besides the sharps and the flats, besides the circle of fifths and the scales for the singing purposes, there is also the notation of the clefs. And this chart here shows how you do some explanation about the usage of clefs. Most of the time is to do avoiding ledger lines. And that was especially, for instance, important to Bach, who traced the 5 lines of his staffs on paper, which was expensive to purchase and for his income, and he always aligned them very closely when he aligned the 5 lines of the staffs, so he can write the most piece or pieces, even sometimes several pieces at the same time on the same page. It's economy. Except that that doesn't leave room for ledger lines when you play above the given range of a given instrument. Of course, the instruments of the time didn't have very large range, even in the harpsichord compared to the piano, but regardless, the notation had to take in account for voices as well when you sing tenor, alto, soprano, and therefore they locked it into 7 clefs. So if you take the lowest note of the lowest line of the lowest clef, called bass clef, or F on the 4th line, being a G, and the highest note of the higher line of the highest clef, called treble clef for a purpose, the G on the 2nd line clef, you obtain a G and an F. And in between D, F, A, C, E, G, B, D, aligned by thirds, since the lines are aligned by shelvings, if you want, for an image of it, by thirds. The fifths, or the shelves of thirds, will be in the scale. I insist on this reshape of the same sounds, notes, tones. In fifths, in thirds, and in steps, tone or semitones. And in order to have the notation avoiding the ledger lines as much as possible and adapting to the relative range of voices or given instruments that have those ranges that correspond, like the tenor with the bassoon, or the cello and the alto with the viola, and perhaps the clarinet, and the soprano with the violin, and perhaps the flute. And the piano, very often the right hand is written, notated. It's not always been. In Bach's time was on soprano clef, but nowadays it's always on treble clef. And the left hand on the piano is most of the time notated obviously in bass clef, but if you use F on the third line is the baritone clef, which is lesser used. Of course, most of these clefs, the exception of the viola clef, are not as much used as they used to be used in the past, when you had motets that were sung by chorales and voices like 8 to 16 up to 40 voices, and so the notation with the clefs was essential. But if you were to write them all in order to demonstrate, you can see that you can align them on 11 lines, which then takes care of the ledger lines, but of course it makes it very confusing. So therefore the 11 lines are reduced to groups of 5 lines, and you move your clef by the marker of the given key. And of course, to obtain the movement of thirds, like we did earlier when I demonstrated that for the circle of fifths, you skip a fifth of the circle of fifths to obtain the step motion. If you skip 2 fifths, then you obtain the thirds. In this case, for the order of the lines of the staff, which are by thirds. And by the way, so are the chords, also aligned by thirds. The intervals are always inverted in a total number of 9. If you take a second, inverted by a seventh, and the third inverted by a sixth, the fourth by a fifth, the fifth by a fourth, the sixth by the third, and the seventh by the second. These are just the intervals, the distance between 2 notes. We don't talk about chords yet. When we arrive to the chords, which are starting with the triads, once you add a note extra than the 2 of the interval distance between the first and the next per note, then we arrive at this explanation, which I think clarifies a lot of misunderstandings or perhaps bypassings, because we all get to play the pieces or sing the pieces or discover the pieces of music without going through the step-by-step understanding of how it goes from circle of fifths through intervals into chords and then further, obviously. Here I'm into the step of the chords. And I indicate this by fundamental or root, or 1, third for 3, and 5 for the fifth. So if you take tonic, like again the example of C, E the third, G the fifth, and again the root, and again the third and the fifth. And if you canonically play a second voice starting on the note after the first, which is the root, on the third you play the root, sorry for this, on the fifth you play the third, on the root you play the fifth, and they follow each other in inversions, which are created for the 3-part chords exactly by a canon on 3 parts: the root, the third, and then the root. The third with the fifth, and then the root plays what the third played. If you want to visualize it, I will play it for you, therefore hear it by this visualization of sounds, by 3 octaves. But if you hear it all narrowed to the same octave, and if you take each of these canonically obtained inversions of the same degrees, then you obtain a first inversion, 6th chord, sorry, or the second inversion, 6/4 chord, or the root position chord. So before they become vertical, the way we understand it, to visualize it on the keyboard, before the voice leading that allows for a melodic sequencing of the voice leading, it's all about beauty in the sense of aesthetics, and about finding a way to organize, combine these sounds in a harmonious way, which is the whole point of the word harmony. But of course it can mean different things in different contexts of different time periods. The very concept of dissonance evolves with time. But in this case, we stay at the tritone for the main dissonance, which creates the tension that calls for a resolution, and that creates a perfect cadence, which in a way defines the tonality in which you are, and therefore it allows you to go to other tonalities and define them, or have secondary dominants that define the first even more so, and then you can use other cadences to even more redundantly express the meaning of this tonality. In other words, you travel within your tonality with the different degrees, the 6th, the 2nd, the 5th, and the 1, and you realize that you're just being in a sort of a microcosm of sorts, that is the ecosystem of the tonality, with its hierarchy of degrees that come from the circle of fifths into scales, and you call them dominant, tonic, and they have different weight, more or less than others, in this hierarchy of tonalities degrees. And the chords themselves, the reflection of these motions, the motions of the bass line. And therefore I insist on that understanding of the voiced, layered organizations that sliced vertically become a chord, but that originally come from a canonic accumulation, if you want, of the shelvings of the different construction notes of the chord, the root, the third, the fifth. Now, how many more can you add beyond the fifth? Of course, you can add the 7th, and then you can add one more, which would be, again, all according to the root, an 11th and a 13th. But then, after you go to 15th, the 15th is the first. So therefore, you cannot have a chord that goes beyond a 13th. And that is rarely seen. If it's on a dominant, like C major, dominant is G, leading tone first, third, second, third, the fifth from the root is perfect fifth, second degree. Fourth voice would be the minor 7th compared to the root dominant, the 5th degree, and therefore creates inside the tritone between the leading tone, the 3rd and the 7th. So major triad, minor 7th. As a function, we call it dominant 7th. But it's a minor 7th with a major triad. And then you can add to it another 3rd, which would be then the major 9th. Again, according to the root of the chord on the dominant, which is G. And in this case, because C major doesn't have flat or sharps, it's easy to visualize that is a major ninth after the minor seventh. And the 11th, which is the C, would be a perfect fourth if it wasn't an octave above. Therefore, it's not major or minor since it's perfect. And then the 13th is obviously major because it's the octave above of the 6th, being an E over the G. Now, naturally, each of these shelving for the chords, the intervals of each of these shelvings are defined by the tonality in which you are. In C major, obviously, with the white keys, we hear mostly the tones, so it's a major third, perfect fifth, minor seventh, major ninth, perfect 11th, major 13th, and perfect 15th. Of course, the 15th doesn't matter because it's a unison, it's the same thing, it's an octave above. It's 2 octaves above. But then, of course, the distance between the shelving can be also artificially altered compared to the tonality in which they are placed, on the degree on which they are, in this case on the dominant. And so you could have an augmented fifth, which can be also in an augmented seventh, and then you have a major ninth. Or you could have a regular, in C major regular, major third for the leading tone, perfect fifth, minor seventh, but instead of the major ninth, you can minor it and flatten it. Then you can obtain a minor dominant ninth. And if you omit the root, which very often doesn't hold, you obtain a 7th degree, which is a diminished chord, triad, diminished seventh, all minor thirds. We call it diminished seventh, but in fact, in its function with omitted dominant, it's a dominant or leading tone, therefore leading tone going to the tonic. Perfect cadence function 5-1, 7-1 with a minored ninth. According to the original root, if omitted, then it becomes a 7th because you don't call it anymore ninth. And you could be in minor or in major in the resolution. You can be in minor or in major, even if you're dominant minor ninth, or if you omitted root dominant minor, therefore leading tone diminished seventh. So it's just to give you an example of why and how these alterations of the degrees that we use on the chordal organization is there to either enhance by augmenting with a sharp to the augmented fifth, or perhaps to minor by flattening the ninth or the seventh, according to the omitted root or not. But in both cases is examples of alterations of the shelving, or if you want another analogy, of the tree and the branches. And so you obtain colorization, atmospherization, therefore it's part of the mood. Again, it's all connected to the mood, it's not disconnected. But it's difficult to speak of the things without also to explain them for what they are, while they also are there because they, in their resonance, bring to the psyche of the listener, that is the performer, a sense of sadness with the minor, or a push of intensity, perhaps of drive, perhaps of exhilaration when it's an augmented chord and you feel there is a self-explained tension release if it's extended, or diminished if it's shrunk. For the half tone of one or another of the portions, or therefore the general proportions of the chords. And so in order to understand that more clearly, you can see that the chords are organized obviously by thirds, and if middle C is the note of reference, the third above the fifth, the seventh, etc., the ninth. If you go the thirds down, A, F, D. So you have loosely the leading tone in the upper notes and the subdominant and the second degree in the bottom notes. But if you do your fifth down from the tonic in the order of the circle of fifths from which we started, or you go up with the circle of fifths, then you have the dominant and the subdominant, and the dominant of the dominant, and you have again the 7 tones of C major, the natural 7 tones, in order of thirds. When they were, in the scale. I always stress these 3 elements so that you can start listening to the 3 at the same time in parallel, or discovering how they hide under the other, or how they are behind the first or the other. In other words, they are part of the construction of our system that is based on organization by circle of fifths. Now, if you try to go beyond the chords and you try to understand how they are organized in the scale, then of course you understand that on each degree of the scale, and degree has to be not confused with the root of a given chord for the construction of the chord on that degree. For instance, in C major, if I play the scale with the degrees in the left hand, I have of course my 7 degrees, and in the right hand on each chord, on each degree of the left hand, therefore you play a chord. Case, a major chord, minor chord on the 2nd degree, minor chord on the 3rd degree, major chord on the 4th degree, major chord on the 5th degree, minor chord on the 6th degree, and diminished triad on the 7th degree, and again tonic, obviously major. And therefore you have to hear how each of the degrees of the scale spawns its own chords, major or minor, in major sevenths or in triads. Minor 7th, major 7th, minor 7th with major triad, but because it's the dominant position of the degree, then it's the function that is called dominant. And here you go back to minor 7th because it's the interval between the root and the top of the chord. Same thing for the 7th degree, which then becomes either leading tone 7th or in fact half diminished 7th, because the minor 7th and the 5th is diminished, but the minor is not diminished for the 7th. The minor 7th remains open. So you have the different chords on the different degrees that have their different functions with their different specificities between major, minor, diminished, and therefore they have to have their own placement in the society of the tonality, by being dominant or not, or tonic or what. And in the case here of this, it's very interesting to observe that some of the notes of the chord can be altered, as I said earlier. But then, if you want to go into understanding this further, we have to start working with the chords in their organization as inversions to their roots outside of their placement of the scale. That will come later. Again, we need to go step by step, because it's always the problem of tonal harmony is that whatever the skills of a performer, of a singer, or of a music lover who even doesn't play an instrument, we bypass a lot of the understanding of the how things function, how they come to become what they are that we play, without having always followed each of the steps. And we have bypassed some steps, either by the industry of playing, either by guessing it or by the ear being guiding us, but we're not very sure how we got there, but we know it's right because we hear it, the tension, the release, the major, the minor. And inevitably, when we revisit in this order of how things go from the circle of fifths through the scale, and therefore by the thirds organizing the chords. Before we find them how they're organized in the tonalities in which we use them, we have to define them by themselves. So first comes this demonstration of root positions and inversions. Usually we demonstrate the inversions by inverting the notes, and here we're going to invert the functions to make it more clear on a single note, which will become different functions alternatively, but by staying the same. This way we visualize the meaning of the inversions, which the change of the notes themselves almost divert us from understanding. Oh yeah, on the surface we do is a sixth chord because of the distance between the bass note and the top interval, sixth, and because the next one is also in second inversion having a sixth between the root and the top, but this time it has a fourth inside rather than a third, then we call it a sixth fourth. That being said, they sound the same because there are inversions and replacements of the shuffling of the positions of the shelvings. But we want to understand more in depth the meaning of the inversions, which is in this case, when the shelves are organized by thirds, the bottom one is the root, then third, and then fifth. And if we do a first inversion on the note of C, then we have to find our root a third under in order to have a fifth above if C is the third. And then we have a major triad on A flat if our first note of reference is C. And in the first inversion, the sixth chord. But this time we have E flat and A flat rather than E, G, C, which would be the reorganization of the order of the notes of the same notes. Here it's different notes, but with the same bass note. First inversion, and when the C becomes the fifth, it's a F major triad in the sixth fourth, second inversion. Root, first inversion. This is the omitted root. It's not omitted, it's just I hinted. It's just replaced in the middle since it's shuffled by the fact of being inverted. In minor, then C being the root, minor third, perfect fifth. Then A minor would be our first inversion, sixth chord. And F minor would be our second inversion, that being the sixth fourth chord. Then we have the diminished. It's a triad that has two minor thirds inside itself in the shelving. If A is the third for C being the same notes, changing function from root to third, then we have the first inversion sixth chord, and same thing with the root on the diminished fifth, because the single same C note changing function becoming the diminished fifth, you have G flat A, and therefore you have first for the root, second for the first inversion, and third for the second inversion on the diminished chord. Now for the augmented chord, it's a little bit trickier. It's because inharmonically spelled, again like in the chromatic scale earlier, we had this question about inharmonic spelling of the same tone, at least on the keyboard, being same. If I say that the root is C, and I want then to use it as a third, then my root would be A flat, so my first inversion would be, and then if my first note C is the augmented fifth, then my note root would be E, E, G sharp, C, or you can spell it B sharp instead of C. But then if I say, okay, root position, first inversion, second inversion, they sound the same. Therefore, in order to explain them, demonstrate them, understand them, I have to spell them. And to spell them, I have to resolve the leading tone in the root position where C is the root and G sharp is the augmented fifth. then G sharp resolves to A in A minor. First inversion, if C in the root note is becoming the third, and the root is in fact A flat, then the leading tone fifth augmented one is E. So in the first inversion, I resolve the leading tone in the middle voice, as I did in the root position on the soprano voice. And if this note, the Do, the C again, is the augmented fifth, then I have the root to be the E, the G sharp being the third, and the augmented fifth would be B sharp in its inharmonic spelling, and the leading tone would be resolved in the bottom part. So I could say root position, first inversion, second inversion. But I need to do with the resolution. Then I switch to the four-part chords, like the major triad. I add the seventh, in this case the minor seventh, and therefore for the purpose of the fact that it is called so for its function, we'll call it dominant seventh, instead of calling it a minor seventh with a major triad. Which it is, but it's longer to say. First inversion, second inversion, third inversion, coming from the same principle, which is I keep the same note in the bass note, unlike most times when we switch the order of the notes to obtain the first, second, and third inversion. And here it's... So to go slowly, the root is C, the third is E, the fifth is G, and the B flat is the seventh. Then if C becomes the third, then the root is A flat, E flat for the fifth, G flat for the seventh. In the first inversion, keeping C on the bass note, I have the 6-5 chord, or first inversion. And if C is the fifth, then A is the third, and E flat is the minor seventh. Therefore, I have a dominant 7 on F. But because I construct it on the C, it's therefore 4-3, we call it our second inversion. And then if C is the 7th, and the root is D because it's minor 7th with a major triad, which constructs together what we call a dominant 7th, but on the single C, that doesn't change, then we have a 4-2, third inversion. Therefore, we have root position, first inversion, second inversion, third inversion of dominant 7th. And we apply the same system on minor 7th. And we apply the same system on the major 7th. Now, the major 7th is a very interesting sounding combination that has in its hum the minor second or major 7, therefore in the inversion, and it sounds very intensely spread if it's the major 7, which is the maximum spread, or very closed, it's a maximum closing of a semi-step in the case of the minor second. So I give you the example. The major 7th with the middle note C as our bass note, being the root, being the third, being the fifth, and being the 7th. So the root position, first, second, and third inversions sound a little bit more intense because the major 7th and the minor 2nd in their inversions are very intense compared to, let's say, in minor, or the dominant 7, or the half diminished 7th, half diminished being the one that is with a diminished 5th and a minor 7th. In this case again, C is the bass note, which remains. Then second will be the first inversion that has the A as the root if C is the third, and E flat as the diminished 5th, and G as the minor 7th, or C as the root no more but the fifth. And what kind of fifth? It has to be diminished. And therefore the minor third and the minor seventh. And then same thing when C becomes the seventh, minor seventh, diminished fifth. So we obtain instead of or in major or in dominant or in minor, or therefore in minor with fifth, diminished fifth or half diminished. So if it's placed on the leading tone, we call it leading tone 7, but it's the same chord. But if you use it on the same bass note, for the dominant, for the major, for the minor, for the half diminished. This way you can even compare them and see them, visualize them, hear them, and get familiar with them by the combination of seeing, hearing, and writing. And I think it helps a lot to, again, get penetrated by the grammar of the meaning of the words, the sounds, and not just their resonance and how they talk to us. Inevitably they do, and that's how we perceive them, if it's a drama or a happiness. But again, I like to always think we need to think separately of the structure and the meaning, and how the one creates the other or brings to the other what we take as a feeling from that meaning. Now, of course, in the four-part chords, you have also the diminished seventh, which is a combination of two tritones or from only minor thirds, like a diminished triad. This chord, by essence, having all these diminished fifths in itself, by itself, it's the king of the tonalities undecided chord, the one that is needing to be resolved no matter what. But it has to be resolved. It cannot just stay there. It's the chord that creates the sense of emotional expectation, drive, sometimes anxiety, hope, but you don't know if it's going to go and where and how. In other words, this is the chord that romantic music used a lot to delay tactics for an expression of longing or of expectation or of a build-up of drama. Again, the chord itself doesn't do any of that. It's how it's placed in a tonality. But since we have first to define it, we have to just study it by itself, like anatomy, the bones by themselves, before you see them all organized into a body and walk, or stand. In other words, it's a little bit more of an anatomical situation. And let's say that the diminished seventh, like the half diminished seventh, or the triad that is diminished, has mainly in the usage of harmony leading tone position because of its root note, which is the leading tone. And if the root becomes the third, then, and if it's the fifth, and if it's the seventh, but again it's spelled the same. No, it sounds on the piano the same, but it is spelled differently. In the case of D flat major, if C, the bass note, is the root, is C, E flat, G flat, B double flat, the order of the minor thirds, shelving. Again, my analogy is always the same. And if C becomes the third, then therefore the diminished fifth is E flat, G flat, so you spell it C, E flat, G flat, but this time A natural, and you will resolve the leading tone, A to B flat, and you'll be in B flat. If C is the diminished fifth of the root F sharp, then you have the diminished seventh E flat, and you spell it C, E flat, F sharp, A, and then the F sharp is the resolution of the leading tone in G major. So you did first, and clearly the bottom note is a leading tone root, 7-1 or 5-1 if you do the omitted root for its function, in D flat major with a B double flat going down to A flat, leading tone being C, a As a first inversion, the A natural, no more B double flat, goes up to B flat. And the spelling is C, E flat, G flat, A. Then, when C is the seventh, so you go the fifth. Excuse me for confusing you. It's confusing enough like that. I'm confusing myself when I try to clarify it for you. But C being the diminished fifth, the spelling F sharp A, C, E flat in G. And if C is the diminished seventh this time finally, then it's spelled obviously C, and then the D sharp, F sharp, A, C. Since you always have to spell it in the order of the shelving by thirds. So it becomes, and the four resolutions create their own diminished seventh. But since you have 12 tones chromatically, therefore if you did 4, you have another 8 tonalities in which you can resolve this same chord, but no more as a dominant directed to its own tonic, but this time through a dominant as an altered degree of a given tonality. So you can do as a sharp 4 in G flat, as a sharp 4, and then you go in E flat major, right, as a sharp 4 again, third inversion. You can, what are you doing? My eyes don't see it anymore. You go in C, and then in A. As a sharp 6, you can do in the other 4 tonalities left, which is in D major as a sharp 6, in B major as first inversion, in A flat, and in F major. Now this is a little bit the confusing part. It's a quagmire to explain, and I'm not good at it, but I'm trying. My point being is that the diminished seventh resolves most of the time as 5 or 7-1 if you want. The other ones as altered degrees through their own dominance is just to demonstrate that the diminished seventh chord is the universal chord that can resolve in every of the 12 tonalities, but in 4 of them is really the one that we use about most, which is as a dominant or a leading tone. So this was for the demonstration, but in reality I think it's a problem. Sometimes it confuses more than it explains by trying to be extensive about the various options of the diminished seventh, other than as a dominant. Once we explained the 3 and 4 part chords, now I would like to explain the starting of using the chords in the society, as I like to call it, or therefore in the tonality, in its ecosystem. C major being the key. The first degree is major, the fourth degree and the fifth degree are major triads. The second, third, and sixth are minor triads. And the seventh degree is diminished. Therefore, the cadence sheet, as we call it, is in fact the one that defines the tonality by simple cadential motions of the bass line defining the degrees from the major chord starting point. In this case, the next page will be from the minor chord starting point. But in this case, it's the major chord starting point, which will be C major, in C major being the first degree. And then common note and contrary motions or neighboring tones would be our voice leading rules. And we do 4 and 5 and 1 to define the tonality. Starting on the first degree, which is the first degree's ending chord as well, since we want to say that we're in C major. Why can't we say we're in C major just by playing the chord? It's because we can be in other unless we heard the dominant, which is this, because of the leading tone. And before that we have to hear the subdominant, because it's our other fifth in the circle of fifths. So it's defining the hierarchies from the subdominant and the dominant, and that becomes the signature of the tonality. If you start on the fourth degree, finish with 5-1, again the perfect cadence. And if you start on the 5th degree, instead of going directly 5-1, like you didn't do directly 4-1, it exists as a cadence called plagal, and this perfect. But to define the tonality, you have to go through the different degrees that define it. In this case, from the 5th degree, you do the deceptive cadence 5-6, which is deceptive because the leading tone goes to the tonic as it does in the tonic when you do the perfect, but the bass line, instead of going down the 5th, goes up a step on the 6th degree, which is a delay tactics that allows to then go from the subdominant back from the dominant, and this time to the tonic. It takes a bit longer to define the tonality from the dominant because we want to be explicit. And from the subdominant, and from the tonic. And it's important to insist on the quality of playing the repeated notes held, these which are common between triads, in this case CC or GG, and not play chords on bass line, but play a soprano part and an alto part, and an alto tenor part in this case, which in the piano can be shared between the bass note left hand and the right hand playing the two top parts, so you can play legato and not thumb, 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 thumb. That cannot be legato, or hardly. It could, but it's complicated. So it's important, therefore, on the piano when you practice the keyboard harmony is to organize the voice leadings in your hearing, singing and spelling and writing, but in your playing you can then dissociate the notation from the function of the chordal progression, and then you can play the EF in the right hand for the tenor and the D in the left hand, and again the E in the right hand because of the distance between the bass and the tenor, which is a tenth, which is large for most hands. Therefore it can be separated between 3 parts in one hand and 1 part in the other, and in the chord that gets closer to the parts, then you can play the bottom 2 parts in the left hand, and then share therefore the EFDE of the tenor between the 2 hands rather than through the single hand. It's important to take a moment to explain that why it's important, because you have to play on the piano like you want to hear it by SATB choir, or you want to hear it in the motions of the voices, regardless if they're sung or played by instruments individually or together by the same performer in the piano playing. And start singing one, playing the other. Mi, fa, re, mi. Okay. E, F, D, E, G, A, G, C, B, C. For instance, and even if you don't have the high-pitched voice, which I developed with the head singing of solfege since a child, you can do it down. C, B, C, G, A, G, E, just to vocalize it or say it even without singing it. You can hear G, A, G, E, F, D, E, B, C, B, C, and you start hearing speaking, playing in this case, and combining speaking or singing, the layered voicing, and you start hearing how they move, how they stay, how they combine. I know it sounds obvious because I keep repeating that pattern, and you could say, oh, I got it, which is true, it's good that you did. But what matters is not to play it, but rather, and by doing so, you are penetrated by the meaning of the voice leadings, the common tones which you don't repeat, and then you realize that they are common because you don't repeat. They are no more vertical, only according to the bass, but they're becoming their own voice in their own horizontal display. Same thing happens when you do the major triad starting positions for the cadence in C minor harmonic, because in C minor harmonic the second degree is diminished after the first was obviously minor, but the third is augmented, the fourth is minor, the fifth and the sixth are major, and the seventh is diminished obviously because of the leading tone. So therefore in this case the major triads in harmonic minor are on 6, 5 and 6. So starting on 5 dominant, you do 6, 5, 1 to establish the tonality of C minor in this case, and 6 to end from the 6th degree through the 4th and the 5th. And again, you don't play, because that is to understand, and that's fine. But once you understood, then you start playing it by following the voices and repeating many times. How you can combine the left hand playing 2 voices in the first 2 chords and the right hand. And then in the next chord, you have a larger step, which is in fact an octave between the tenor and the bass. You can take that F in the right hand, you have 3 voices in one hand, and 2 voices and 2 voices, and 1 and 3 voices. You see? So, of course it doesn't sound when you hear it, but when you watch it, you could do substitutions as well for the fingerings, but whichever way you can, in order to not be distracted by the verticality of the chords as such, but in the chords, but in their progression, therefore in their linear voicing, and therefore their shelving and their layering. Same thing now about the major triad starting point in ascending minor. Remember the one that was minor in the bottom and major in the top? So again, if you construct a triad on each of the degrees, minor for the first obviously, but the second is minor, the second is augmented, the fourth and the fifth are major, and 6th and 7th are diminished. Therefore you have to start on the 4th degree with a major triad and finish in C minor, going through 2, 5, 1. Or not. But the point of the little plagal cadence at the end is to simplify that, to signify, that this is C minor after all, even if it's A major. The A natural is not A major, sorry to confuse. The A natural is part of C major, but once you reach the tonic in minor with a minor third, you know you're in C minor, starting with a dominant, which is obviously major because of the leading tone in the third. 4, 2, 5, 1. Same thing applies for starting from the major triad on the descending minor. Remember the one that is the major tetrachord seen from up down, is tone, tone, semitone, but in fact has the flat 7, which allows us to go to my flat 6 whenever the ascending was major 6, that allows us to go to the major 7th, which is the leading tone. So you go up, and in this descent we have the 7th degree, which is flat 7, which is major chord, 6, which is major chord on 6, minor, minor, major on the 3rd degree, and diminished to the 2nd. So starting the progression from the 7th degree, you go 4, 5, 1 into C minor again. Of course, always into C minor, but starting from now 6th degree, dropping down melodically. Sorry, my finger slipped on the F natural. And from the 3rd degree, 4, 5, 1. This cadence sheet is the one that uses the starting point from the major triad in major, in minor harmonic, melodic ascending or descending. The next page treats the problem of starting with the minor triad, in which case we have to do the minor triad in major. So first degree is major, second degree is minor, and third degree is minor. Fourth and fifth are major, sixth is minor, and seventh is diminished. So starting on the second degree, you do in C major 2, 5, 1. Starting on the third degree, do 3, 4, 5, 1. And starting on the sixth degree, 6, 4, 5, 1. Starting from the minor triads in harmonic minor, again harmonic minor, obviously first degree is minor, second is diminished, third is augmented, fourth is minor, fifth is major, sixth is major, and seventh is diminished. Therefore we start with a minor, and we do 1, 4, 5, 1 as we did earlier in major, but this time starting in minor, therefore we end in minor logically. Starting with the fourth degree, 4, 5, 1 as well, and take in account that C, B, C, A, G, G, F, D, E, F, G, C are the 4 layers, and at no point do you have A flat going to be natural in any of the 3 voices over the bass. You have A flat dropping to G, and C dropping to B, and F going to D. So it's do, si, do, la, sol, sol, fa, re, mi, do, in English C, B, C, A, G, G, F, D. And played vertically, so to say, verticalizing the hearing rather on the piano, it's easy to misunderstand, or combination create a misunderstanding that the harmonic minor uses the augmented second as a motion melodically, which it doesn't. That's why it's harmonic. It's because of the harmonic progression 4, 5, 1 that is called harmonic minor as a scale. Then we go into the 2 left minor scales, the ascending, in which case the minor chords from which we start on the first and the second degree, because the other ones are augmented, major, major, and diminished. So from first degree, you use the major 6th leading tone, and then you finish with the plagal just to say it's minor, but it's obvious it's minor because of the first degree. Do, re, mi, si, di, e, f, g, g, a, b, c. It's not so natural for me to sing without solfeging, but anyway, I try. So, it's like mother tongue. I learned it in do, re, mi, fa, sol. That's why it's not natural. It's not. But anyway, it's important to keep logical and apply the system of the English speaking notes, since I started with them. A, B, C, starting from the second degree, 2, 5, 1, which seen in the bass motion is of course a fifth system of movement of perfect fifths. And then everything is circle of fifths. If you start from the fifth to the tonic in major, we did the perfect cadence. This is just a moment away from what we're doing. And then second degree going back to the fifth degree. And then the sixth degree to the second, to the fifth, to the first. And then you start on the third degree. The fifth to the sixth, to the second, to the fifth. And you realize that you have the motions constantly, possibly bypassed. You don't have to always go through each of the fifths. You can go, instead of going 6, 2, 5, 1, you can do 6, 5, 1. You can bypass it, but it is there if you want to spell it fully. And if you start from the third degree, you can go directly to the fourth, but you can go through the sixth and the second and the fifth and the first, which is by the circle of the fifths in the harmonic motion. And if you use inversions, then of course it's more elaborate, therefore you can obtain this voice leading that is more singing, or that has the step motion or the common notes. And the dispositions matter a lot. How you like to spread the voices between them. If it's choir, very often SATB is the 5th and the 10th instead of the 3rd, or bunched in one and separate in the bass distant. This is more equally separated or distanced. It's all about the harmonious organization of the voices, their own harmonious motion through the circle of fifths by passing or by fulfilling them by thirds into other intervals, or fifths, by fourths, by whatever. And the point of the story is that when you hear it, it sounds very natural and flowing. The last thing, which I didn't do yet, and I have to complete it because I got, as usual, sidekicked in my thinking about the order of the circle of fifths in the harmonic progressions, but in this case we have to finish with a minor chord starting on each of the degrees of the descending minor. So the first degree is minor, and the 7th degree is major, therefore 6th 2, but the 5th and the 4th are minor, and the 3rd is major, and the 2nd is diminished. So starting on the 1st degree, dropping down on the melodic descending from the minor triad, we'll do 1, 5, 6, 4, 5, 1. The deceptive and then the perfect cadence. I shouldn't try, I don't know how to do it well when I sing in English. From the 4th degree, it's a very high disposition. Some of the dispositions on this sheet are inevitably a choice of the teacher. You could also bunch them. But the point of the disposition is often to do with instruments, if you use orchestration or instrumentation for chamber music, or if you do choir singing. Obviously, the understanding for the harmonic progression on the keyboard harmony for pianists is to play the bass notes in a separate hand as much as possible. That makes you understand the melodic motion of the degrees of the bass notes. And then how you harmonize each of those with a chord that corresponds either to a numbering, either to a function, because of both in the system. And then you try to combine some of the voices when they're not too stretched, so you can have the legato. But in order to obtain that, you have first to visualize which layer, and then afterwards combine the layers between the two hands. The diminished and the augmented chords have very limited of these. They have the 7th degree in major or minor, or 2nd degree as 2nd degree the minor 5th, or the 7th, and possibly in the augmented, no, but in this case relative minor ascending. It's not relative at all, it's C minor. The 3rd degree. It's only an augmented degree, and it's only the 3rd degree in harmonic minor. So it's mostly for the major triad in major, minor, harmonic, melodic, ascending, descending, and the minor chord starting in major, minor, harmonic, melodic, ascending, and descending. The diminished and the augmented being diminished both major, minor, and augmented only in minor, harmonic. This is very good. Now, I want to stay back for a second with the major as an example, because I want you to understand what is the purpose of the exercises that you can use from this learning of the functions and the chords and the motions and the voice leadings and the correct understanding of the difference between degrees and roots and chords and inversions and all that. These cadential sheets, which we did in major, can be practiced two ways. The first way is by transposition. You take the first one as a capsule, 1451, that one. One, 4, 5, 1, or tonic, subdominant, dominant with leading tone, tonic in C major, and you try to say, I'm going to do the same one on another degree that starts, let's say G major. So which is my subdominant is C, which is my dominant is D, my leading tone is F sharp. So I transpose my first cadence 1, 4, 5, 1 in G major. So I can do it by ear, I can do it by understanding the function of which is the tonic, which is the dominant, which is the subdominant, which is the leading tone in each of the keys in which you want to reproduce this first sequence of 1, 4, 5, 1 bass motion degrees. In D major, 4 is G major, 5 is A major chords, leading tone C sharp. So the transposition is to replace exactly the same pattern of the chords in there is this motion of 1, 4, 5, 1, a tonic, subdominant, dominant, tonic, and you can use it either like that by circle of fifths on A, on E, on B, and name them when you do it. F sharp, subdominant B, leading tone E sharp on dominant C sharp, and tonic A sharp. F sharp, A sharp being the third, of course. Sorry for this. The point of the saying it is that when you go in tonalities which are less often used than C major, G major, D major, like F sharp major or C sharp major, is that you have to not only reproduce it by ear, and if you make a mistake, like, oh, of course it's wrong, so you fix it by the ear, but you want to know that it's the subdominant. F sharp with the A sharp in the third, G sharp the dominant with the B sharp in the leading tone, and C sharp the root of the tonic, therefore in C sharp major the first degree. It's very important to keep in mind the repetitivity, which can be tiring, but it's important because to keep the concentration even when you do the repetitivity. A flat, you could call it G sharp, but it's spelling a nightmare. If you do G sharp, then your subdominant is C sharp, E sharp, G sharp, your dominant is D sharp with the leading tone F double sharp. If you misspell it, rather spell it inharmonically in A flat, then you have subdominant D flat chord F, A flat, E flat, dominant with leading tone G natural in A flat. It doesn't hurt to spell it in a more obvious way, because once you start in the double sharps, it's very confusing and not naturally necessary, because you will not find a lot of tonalities of E sharp major in a piece. There will be F major, for instance, in the spelling. And E flat major, and B flat major, and F major. So if you don't want to think about the function and you just want to do it by ear and you're good at your finger memory, then you can do that. I'm not sure it's necessary, but it's possible, because then your fingers sort of guide your ear, that sort of corrects. But you want to, every time, even in tonalities, and specifically, again, I repeat that, in tonalities that are less often used, like F sharp, C sharp, G sharp, A flat, E flat, not that they're very rare today, because chromatically we use everything, but nevertheless, it is necessary to think the functions as well as the sounds and the fingers. It's a combination, and the keyboard harmonies, when you put in synchronization, just like when the speech and the sounds go together with the thought process all at once, so it becomes fluent. And that fluency doesn't come right away, naturally. You have to first go over the step-by-step section of working, that is understanding, then applying, then implementing, and then rising the tempo until you get to be more immediate flowing and becoming comfortable in tonalities in which usually you don't move with the same comfort because the degrees are confusing you, even if they're obvious by the ear. That is very difficult to not emphasize enough for me, because if not, you bypass the purpose of the exercise. You can do it by ear, but then you don't do it because you understand. If you write it down, you'll understand it by the function. If you play it, you'll do it by the fingers. But if you really want to combine both, you have to hear and think at the same time. And to apply it in the repetitivity until you do several times the circle of the fifths of the tonalities. And this is by the transposing part of the exercise. And this transposing part can be very fun or can be very boring. I understand that very well. It's like practicing scales for fingers. Here is practicing chord progressions for keyboard harmony fingers, so to say, and of course, brain and heart. But it necessarily goes by the repetitivity. And it goes by getting you could also have some friend who tells you, why don't you try to play a perfect cadence in F sharp? And you have to think, okay, where is my dominant? And then you do, if you're not to do it by a certain order in fifths, thirds, or seconds, you can do it. Again, by doing it so, you end up by doing it by ear. By doing it randomly, you start understanding that you can do it on any. But I think before you get to that point, which is more entertaining, without to be quizzed by somebody, but just pushing yourself to say, let me just tell myself a random tonality. Oh, let me do it in E flat major. But it's easier said than done, and because the time it takes to figure it, configure it, and implement it, organize it, and then display it, without to make a mistake, and without to get frustrated with oneself, oh come on, I heard it, why do I just not push the right key, is because it takes time. And that is the problem with everything, but it's a great feeling too when you achieve it. Of course, that is easy moralism, but the point of the exercise is to transpose the patterns that you see on the page. And therefore, you take each of these capsules, 1, 4, 5, 1, 4, 5, 1, 5, 6, 4, 5, 1, and you play them on different tonalities. Now, the second exercise, which I think is a little bit more challenging for the attention and perhaps less boring for the repetitivity, because you have to be more challenged to configure it every time, is to use for the departure note, which in this case, in the example it is written, is a C major triad in C major tonality, is then to change the function but keep the chord. So all the page will be played with major triads, which will be all systematically the C major triad, but each time the C major triad will change its position in the tonality in which it will be resolved. Therefore, if you do the first line, if C major chord becomes the 4, 5, 1 subdominant of a tonality which has to be G major, if as it is subdominant is the fourth degree goes to the 5th degree leading tone, F sharp. So instead of doing 1, 4, 5, 1, 4, 5, 1, 5, 6, 4, 5, 1 in C major, you'll do 1, 4, 5, 1, 4, 5, 1 in G major, and as a dominant 5th degree in F major, 5, 6, 4, 5, 1. And every time the C major chord changes the first note degree, then the tonality changes but not the chord. Therefore, if you do in minor, 5, 6, 4, 5, 1, but on the C chord, it will be in F minor. And in which tonality is C major chord a 6th degree in minor, in E minor. therefore it's the arrival note that is the tonality in which you go, but the first note is always the C major chord, which changes its function and therefore brings you to this other tonality. Therefore you modulate rather than transpose, which is the first exercise. The second exercise in which we are, it's the modulation. The third line is therefore for the ascending minor with major triad starting. So a fourth degree of a C major chord is fourth degree in G minor, or in F minor. And if in descending minor C major chord is 7th degree, you're in D minor. If it's 6th degree, you're in E minor. And if it's in if it's 3rd degree, it's in A minor. Naturally, you don't have to take always C major as starting chord for the whole page. You can choose another chord, E flat major, and then if E flat as a chord is the 4th degree of 4-5-1 second capsule, you're in B flat major, and then if it's 5th degree, that will be then in A flat major. I purposely understand that this exercise is a little bit more challenging, but I think purposely, I mean it, is more meaningful for learning, understanding, and combining the playfulness of the degrees, the playfulness of the voice leading, and the playfulness of playing it on the piano in the literal meaning of the word for pianists. Or even, if not for pianists, also to this keyboard portion of the harmony. To organize the motion of the chords, the positions and their inversions, and the tonalities in which you travel by the functions through which you go, you figure out in tonalities in which you rather less often go that you can. And this gives you a feeling of freedom, because when you sight read a piece or memorize a piece and it goes into some section that has different sequences, or different sequence organ or of chords progressions, that becomes very difficult. And then it's easier to figure it out when you have practiced it separately, as a chord progression through the cadences in the different tonalities, through transposing or modulating. The last exercise that is necessary for keyboard harmony fluency is to start working on the sequences. The sequences are reproducing a pattern at a different degree of step or interval according to the baseline, and therefore organizing this in your voice leading and spreading of the voices on the keyboard, sung, played, or performed anyway, one way or the other. But these are very important sequences, because they teach you how to organize your hearing by reproducing a pattern of a bass line, but as well of voice leading. The first one is in B flat, and it has a triad on each ascending fourth by step up. So you reproduce this on that, this on this, this on that, this on that. Or the second exercise is after this one, which we just heard. The second is descending fourths by thirds. So you start, and it reminds you of the Pachelbel canon, obviously. Applying triads in root position on each of the notes. And so if you do that and you want to visualize it as written out chordal position, this is the one for the first one. Repeated notes, not repeating. The common notes. And the second one is the descending fourth by thirds. important to always visualize it written out for pianists, so to say, with two staffs and two voices in each hand. It's more important to visualize it as a figured bass that has, in this case, only triads, but the motion of the bass line is very important, the melodic motion of the bass line. And practicing sequences on the piano is a very important portion, if not most important portion, I think, of the keyboard harmony. Practicing is in order to become fluent in every tonality, as we did in the cadence sheet earlier, but as well through passing tones, through patterns that are more elaborate, but which are limited in time. Is sometimes the pattern is only 2 notes, and the reproduction is at a given distance. And sometimes the pattern can be 4 notes, and you can do more elaborate solutions for more elaborate voice leadings, which give you more elaborate stretches of the imagination for the different patterns. In fact, you develop your thinking through the capacity of the voice leading superpositions. Naturally, in the case of the G major one, which is here demonstrated with the ascending fifths, excuse me, Sol, Re, La, Mi, Si, Fa, Do, Sol, G, D, A, E, B, F sharp, this one. So you have a chord on each triad. Of course, that is the most natural, simple way to solve it, to display it rather than solve it. But if you use the voicing with more elaborate combinations of voices, which are, in that case, imitations with each other, and become a little bit more singing, even, I would say, than only played and displayed for the chord functions that they are. There it is. Sol, Fa, Mi, Sol, oh sorry, G, F, E, G, B. And the second voice would be the tenor, so you would have, instead of doing it by 2 patterns, you do it by 4. And then you have a canonic between soprano and alto. And then the alto continues the step by 2. Such were the different dispositions and elaborate displays that we did with Mademoiselle Boulanger when we studied them, because even if the page 60 something of the Dubois harmony book displayed them very simplistically, which is right and is not wrong, even if it's not have to be played so uglily as I just did purposely. She made a search for different solutions that could give us a little bit more of a expressive, canonic, voice-led separations of, in other words, more creative voicing. All of a sudden you become more elaborate in your vocabulary, you can be more expressive in the nuancing of your expression, it can be all these things that you're not in the beginning. Become cultivated. You cultivate your own hearing by organizing the voice leading and being able to play it and display it. To a certain point, it's all these exercises of the sequences are not an arrival point by itself. They're just a process, rather than an arrival point where you say, okay, I can play all the sequences, so what? I think it's more saying, I can play all the scales, but then I cannot play still a piece. It's the construction materials for the pieces, it's the underlining, it's the understanding and the hearing. It enhances both your fingers' capacity, even if it's not for virtuosity speed, but for voicing, which will happen in fugues constantly, where you have to display differently with the 10 fingers of the two hands the different voices that appear, organize them and bring them out, layer them, hear them, sing them, play them, chew them, as I would like to say sometimes, almost speak them, write them down, copy in from memory, play it from your writing, write it in the clefs, think it, hear it, live with it, it becomes you. And I think that is very important, that ultimately the circle of fifths that is there, even in the most intricate voice combinations of the layered organizations of crossing voices and of the beauty of the inner voices, nothing is left to be hidden. Everything has to have its harmonious disposition through contrapuntal or polyphonic organization. I think it's always searching for the beauty in everything, included in miscellaneous patterns or parts or organizations. It's not just organizing chords on top of bass lines, organizing chords on hanging from a melodic line, but to hear them what you hear, you feel, what you feel, you understand, what you understand, you're combined with your tips of your fingers feeling. Keyboard harmony, it's a very sensorial approach of organizing your hearing through a capacity of displaying it. And therefore, when you play a piece of music and you have some section that has its own peculiar chromatic or not, melodic or more or less patterned into some kind of sequence or perhaps cadence, it's only tools, it's not the whole piece obviously, but you all of a sudden recognize it and you go, oh, this is like what I've practiced, not because it is raw like that, but it's implemented and it becomes Brahms or Chopin or Liszt or Rachmaninoff or Ravel or Haydn, and it's such a different styles of expression, of moods, of time periods, while using through the circle of fifths system the basics of the common language with incredibly individual accents that become the languages themselves, and you become able to be a polyglot. You speak many languages because you can play as comfortably in D sharp minor, like Bach Prelude and Fugue from the well-tempered clavier, and think D sharp, F sharp, E sharp, G sharp, F sharp, A sharp, G sharp, B natural, A sharp dominant, D sharp, and then the descending that Bach writes with the ascending minor, his right to be not following the rules, I guess. C double sharp, B sharp, A sharp. He should have gone C sharp, B natural, A sharp to be melodic descending, but and then G sharp, F sharp, E sharp, F sharp. This is nothing but the first bar, or the first two bars. To be able to hear them and tell them to yourself when you play them, so you understand. Of course, it could be in D minor, and you can transpose it in each, just like. But they do change because of the display on the keyboard. The topography changes, but also the melodic harmonic combination makes us think, oh my god, A minor is some more sad than F sharp minor, or less sad than C sharp minor. And I don't know why we say that. Most of the time we are probably as musicians grow up to hear pieces that sort of capture the emotional imagination of ours and say, oh, every C minor piece is tragic, like the Fifth Symphony. And it happens to be the case for most, but it's not always necessarily only that the case. And therefore, yes, I like to say that because it's important not to only think theory and then expression, but to combine the two. The soul and the thought, the mind and the heart. I believe in that kind of stretto that comes to the point of why all that is important is because the circle of fifths leads to everything, but then you have to escape it to be able to refine it and decipher it and discover it hidden in the bushes of the scores or in the intellectual thought processes of the composer's writing, or the emotional connection that it creates with you regardless of your level of understanding or explaining of it. You never will really explain why it's beautiful, but you will explain to yourself how it's done. And then you might connect it to why it's beautiful, or you might just accept that it's beautiful because it moves you. But you can explain it, and then you can start organizing some of these in some kind of order of hierarchy for yourself. It doesn't have to mean the same thing in G sharp minor for a given instrument player or singer or another, or just a listener. And you can be in transposition through relative pitch, it's all the same. But if you have perfect pitch, or even if you have a tendency to be able to understand which note you hear, then the intervals being the same, the tonalities change their personality almost for you, as if they reveal themselves different, and you say, oh, I can never hear this piece in this key. As if it's not the same piece, but it is, since the intervals are the same, the proportions are the same, just sitting higher or lower, but it's still you, or the structure of the body. I think all these analogies between the shelving for the chords and the tree and the branches, the major and the minor, with the atmosphere that it creates for the mood, and the organization of the tetrachords with half minor, half major, and how you organize the understanding of these intricacies. I find it fascinating, and mostly so because most of the time all of us who deal with music at different levels of our involvement in music, we tend to overpass or bypass some steps of the understanding of how things lead to each other. The circle of fifths to the scale, the tetrachords to the chordal progressions, the chordal progressions to the circle of fifths, to the cadences, to the organization of the tonality, the sequences, how to travel through the circle of fifths in order to transpose or modulate, and practice these in different appropriate intellectual and emotional ways. I insist on keeping the emotional part of it. Probably it sounds childish, but I think that if it's not disconnecting too much the one of the other, kills the purpose of it. You feel like, oh my God, all this, I don't care how I call it, I don't care how it's spelled. It could say, I don't care which degree it is, I don't care to know what it would be if it was misspelled in this, and if the secondary dominant was that. I just know that it makes me cry or it makes me happy. It's true. That is the purpose of it. It's perhaps the alpha and the omega, but in between you have the technique, the explanation, the process. And once you become able to interiorize it, to make it yours, yes, you're cultivated, you're shaped by it. You're able to guess things. You're starting to hear things that are more nuanced than you could conceivably hear before, because either it goes too fast, either you play it in a way that you don't have time to think, or the ear takes over what the brain doesn't follow, or the fingers in the memory overwhelm the understanding, and then if you play the wrong key, then you don't know where you're in the piece. Is embedding a GPS inside you musically, so that it drives you, guides you, and gets you out of when you get lost, back on the road, and makes you merge back with the essence of it. I believe very much that keyboard harmony for performers or even non-performers is a very beautiful connection of combining the different senses that connect us to music: the hearing, the reading, and the making. I really think that I was blessed as a child to have discovered these intricacies. and to use them for my own composition or my interpretations, because I hear the pieces I play before I play them, and when I play them I try to continue listen to them in all of their subtle layering. And I find that to simplify is a little vulgar, and to overcomplicate often leads to get away from it. So I try to find a way to keep both in the same range of not going overly technical nor overly away from the technicality. Something has to be there to explain the mechanism of how it works. And when you play it, you enjoy it, you repetitively play the piece if you're a pianist, and you don't have to always think, oh, this is my subdominant, and now Mozart is going to the leading tone, and now he's doing this. It could be in the realm of the obvious, or it could be in the realm of the I don't care because I'm playing it. Or it can be I want to understand how I'm going to implement it in the repeat or the second time on the recap, how the tonality appears differently with the theme presented in the principal key and all these things. So there is portion of the grammar that brings you closer to the emotion of the words that you use into expressing yourself as a writer, even if you use the words commonly every day. And I think you use the notes of music as a musician every day, but the way you organize them is through the soul and the meaning of them. I really thank you very much for having attended this very long demonstration, which I hope wasn't that long in the sense of tedious. Thank you very much.